with Myanmar, we're seeing a history that begins with a forced culture. We're not seeing the constructed identity that we saw in India, leading to a lot of instability where Myanmar is currently an authoritarian military regime right now, which is also driven a lot by Buddhist nationalism. So whereas in India we're seeing those two interpretations, in Myanmar we're seeing one. Because of the influence of the military, we're seeing the military is not just a subset of the government, we're seeing the military is the government. So because we're seeing Buddhist nationalism being the one identity of the country and one form of governance, that is at the expense of Muslim minority groups, leading to the Rohingya Muslims in the Rakhine state of Myanmar being stateless. They cannot form any civil society. A lot of census population data is not accurate because of this. So we're seeing two completely different forms of treatment towards, and especially tolerance of, religious diversity at all. So to this, I conclude Myanmar does not tolerate Muslim minorities. So where do we go from here? We have one of the largest democracies in the world that is backsliding because there is that rise of religious nationalism that's making its way to the government level, but we're seeing one of the most authoritarian regimes, one of the most persecuted minorities in the world today. This is a graph here adopted from Eden dataset. These are principles of, this is for referencing what India's democracy looks like. So we're seeing it's consistently high with elections, which is the green, at the top being the highest. So we're seeing democracy is really important in India. That's why we're seeing a lot of consistency here. Myanmar, on the other hand, we're seeing a completely different story. We're seeing all democratic indexes at 0. So what this means for scholars, for researchers, just us, and anyone who has that influence of religion on what we do and our attitudes towards other people, we see the stronger the democracy, not just the regime, but the democratic principles of having minority voices in there, we're seeing more human rights protections. We're seeing more religious diversity, more inclusion. When we have weaker democracies, when we get more authoritarianism, we become less just. We're having a government that's less responsive to minority voices. So I am concluding in my paper that India's democracy, because it has those institutions and frameworks that accommodate for religious diversity, is more tolerant of religious minorities than Myanmar. Thank you.
Could you go back to the graph for Myanmar?
Yeah.
Could you talk more about why there's such a sharp drop-off there?
Yeah, so in 2021, so this is right after COVID, we're having Myanmar coming right out of an election. In 2021, there was a military coup. So that's where we see that military kind of rejecting any sort of democratic principles. What you see here, where it's kind of consistent, while still lower than India, you're seeing a difference between 2012 to about 2019 as pretty consistent because Democratic Party and people favoring democracy in the country and calling for the accommodation of Muslim minorities, this existed here from 2012 to 2019. In 2020, in that election, the Democratic Party, they won. And that was the first sign of any democracy that could be instilled in the country since it was founded. But because of that, the military didn't want that. And something that I think I talked about a little bit in my paper, which I think further research can definitely look into, is I think a lot of the military's motivations come from with the accommodation of religious diversity and considering the country's never had a stable identity. I think that kind of goes back to a lot of the animosities from colonization, where the country started from a forced culture, Whereas in India, you had Hindus and Muslims, you had diversity who definitely affect a lot of why we're seeing all those democratic principles going to zero.
So I was wondering, I don't object to what you're arguing about the two countries here. I'm just wondering, I can think of cases where countries have gone from authoritarian to democratic, and certain minorities have gone not done as well. Right? So, like in Czechoslovakia, Roma arguably were much better off under the communists than they are now in the nominally independent democratic Czech Republic or Slovak Republic. Or, I mean, think about in Syria, so the Alawites, right? So the Alawites arguably were better off as a group under Assad, who was the opposite of democratic, than they are today. So I'm wondering, like, how would you distinguish the pair that you have there from sort of the other situations where it is possible that sort of democracy leads to bad outcomes, at least for certain minorities?
Yeah. What makes these two countries comparable, and that's why I included that fifth factor that previous research hasn't done, is Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar are stateless, so they don't have any ability to just live. The military government has had operations where they've ethnically cleansed the country of Muslims who are then forced to reside in other neighboring states. Whereas in India, you see because of a lot of democratic principles, especially with elections and having identification cards, I think that's what makes a huge difference, is when you're able to have the ability to vote and just live and be a person in a state and have that recorded, I think does a lot. Because what we're seeing in Myanmar is once you take away that, once you strip any form of identity from anyone, you get back zero.
How the Buddhist church or Buddhist infrastructure operates in Myanmar?
Yeah, there are radical Buddhist monks that have expressed the rejection of any form of Islam in the country. I think what makes it a little more complicated than comparing it to India and how Hindu nationalism looks like is the Buddhist monks aren't the ones that are actively committing the violence. And so I think a lot of it comes from a responsibility as being a Buddhist and a protector of the state that I think the military has. The military has the weapons. They have the ability to do things that Buddhist monks don't. But I think that influence of religion and that call to have a duty to protect the state, but also to protect your religion, has a lot of influence.
Thank you.